Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I've made a career out of photographing places most people will never see. War zones, mountain peaks that require weeks of climbing to reach, jungles so remote that the maps just show green with no names or roads. I sell the photos to travel magazines, adventure companies, stock image websites. It's not a stable living, but it's the only one I've ever wanted. I go where the danger is, where the beauty is, where the average tourist would never think to look. My name is Nolan Cade. I'm 35 years old. I've been doing this work for over a decade, and I thought I'd seen everything the world had to offer. I thought I understood what I was looking at when I pointed my camera at ancient ruins and forgotten places. I was wrong. I came to China to photograph the Wild Wall. That's what they call it, the sections of the Great Wall that haven't been restored for tourists. The parts that are crumbling back into the mountains, overgrown with trees, forgotten by everyone except the farmers who live nearby. No souvenir shops, no crowds of people taking selfies, just ancient stones slowly returning to the earth. Beautiful and eerie, and exactly the kind of thing my clients pay good money to see. I flew into Beijing and took a series of buses and hired cars north into Hebei province. The cities gave way to towns, the towns gave way to villages, and the villages eventually gave way to nothing but mountains and empty roads. By the time I reached the place I was looking for, I hadn't seen another foreigner in 2 days. The village was small, maybe 50 houses clustered in a valley between steep hills. No English signs, no tourist facilities, just farmers and old people who looked at me like I'd arrived from another planet. I found a place to stay, a room above a family's kitchen that smelled like coal smoke and cooking oil, and I waited for my guide to arrive. His name was Wei Liang, early 50s, face weathered by decades of mountain sun and wind, quiet in a way that suggested he'd learned a long time ago that most words were unnecessary. He spoke enough English to communicate, which was more than I'd expected this far from the cities. He agreed to take me into the mountains to find the most remote sections of the wall. But he had conditions. We had to return before dark each day. We had to stay on the south side of the wall. We had to avoid making unnecessary noise when we were near the remote sections. No shouting, no playing music, no calling out to each other across distances. I agreed to all of it without really listening. I'd worked with local guides all over the world, and they always had superstitions. Don't photograph that temple. Don't swim in that river. Don't whistle after sunset. It never meant anything. Just old stories passed down from generations that didn't know any better. We set out the next morning before sunrise. The landscape was stunning, exactly what I'd come for. Steep mountains covered in autumn colors, red and gold and orange, blazing against the gray rock. Mist hung in the valleys like something from a painting, and in the distance, snaking along the ridgelines like the spine of some enormous creature, the wall. Even from miles away, I could see the difference between this and the restored sections near Beijing. This was ancient, crumbling, real. I started taking photos before we'd even begun the serious hiking. Wei was quiet as we walked, which suited me fine. I don't like guides who talk too much. But I noticed that he kept looking north, past the wall, into the wilderness on the other side. His eyes would scan the horizon, then return to the path, then drift north again, like he was watching for something. I asked him what was wrong. He just shook his head. "Bad land up there," he said. "Not safe." I didn't push it. I figured he meant the terrain was dangerous, or maybe there were wild animals. It didn't matter. I wasn't planning to go north of the wall anyway. We reached the first section of wild wall around midday. I stood there for a long moment, just taking it in. The stones were ancient, weathered by centuries of rain and ice, cracked and shifting and slowly falling apart. Trees grew through gaps in the foundation, their roots splitting stone that had stood for 2,000 years. Watchtowers that once held soldiers were now hollow shells. Their roofs collapsed, their interiors filled with debris and bird nests. It was exactly what I'd come for. I spent hours photographing it from every angle, climbing on sections that Wei clearly wished I wouldn't climb, getting shots that would sell for more than this entire trip had cost. As the afternoon wore on, we moved deeper into the mountains. The wall continued along the ridgeline, sometimes rising to impressive heights, sometimes reduced to little more than a mound of rubble. Wei grew more nervous the further we went. He kept looking north, and I noticed his pace increasing, like he wanted to get this over with. That night, back in the village, I sat in my room and did some research on my laptop. Standard history. The Great Wall was built over centuries to defend against northern invaders. Mongols, Xiongnu, various nomadic tribes that threatened Chinese civilization. Different dynasties extended it, rebuilt it, maintained it. Millions of workers died in its construction, the greatest fortification in human history. But as I read, something bothered me. The wall wasn't consistent. In some places, it was a massive stone fortification, 20 feet tall and wide enough for horses to ride along the top. In other places, it was barely a mound of packed earth, 6 feet high at most. In many sections, it was too low, too weak, too poorly designed to stop any serious military force. Historians explain this as different construction periods, different resources, different levels of threat in different areas. That made sense, I supposed. But if you were building a military defense, wouldn't you make it all the same standard? Wouldn't you focus your resources on making the weak sections stronger? Why build a wall that an invading army could just walk around, or climb over, or knock down with basic siege equipment? I mentioned this to Wei's aunt the next morning, an old woman who brought me breakfast and seemed curious about the foreigner staying in her village. Through Wei's translation, I told her I was here to photograph the wall, the parts that tourists never see. She nodded slowly. Then she said something in Chinese that made Wei uncomfortable. I saw his face change, saw him hesitate before translating. I asked what she'd said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me. She says, the wall is not a wall. It is a line. You can photograph the line, but do not cross it. I didn't know what to make of that. I thanked her for breakfast and gathered my equipment. Wei and I set out into the mountains again. The second day took us further than the first. Wei knew these mountains well, and he led me through terrain so rugged, I understood why no tourists came here. By mid-afternoon, we reached what he said was the most remote section of wall he knew. It was a full day's hike from the nearest village, accessible only by paths that weren't marked on any map. The wall here was ancient. Possibly original construction, Wei said. Not rebuilt by later dynasties, not restored by modern preservationists. Just the original stones, laid down more than 2,000 years ago, slowly crumbling, but still standing. In some places, it was reduced to little more than a ridge of rock running along the mountain top. In others, it rose to 15 feet, solid and imposing, despite the centuries of decay. I climbed to the top of a crumbling watchtower and looked out at the view. To the south, the mountains continued in rolling waves of green and gold, beautiful and familiar. Villages were visible in the distant valleys, smoke rising from chimneys, terraced field cut into the hillsides. To the north, everything was different. The colors seemed muted somehow, grayer. The forests were thicker, darker, pressing against the base of the mountains like they were trying to climb up. No villages, no roads, no terraced fields or chimney smoke. Just empty wilderness stretching to the horizon, mile after mile of nothing. I raised my camera and started taking photos of the wall, snaking along the ridge. The light was good, the composition was perfect. But I realized that the best angle, the shot that would really capture the scale and beauty of this place, was from the north side. If I crossed over and shot back toward the south, I could get the wall in the foreground with the civilized mountains behind it. It would be stunning. I told Wei I was going to climb down and cross to the other side for a few minutes. His reaction shocked me. He moved to block my path, physically putting himself between me and the gap in the wall. His English, usually careful and measured, became fragmented, rapid, panicked. "No cross," he said. "Never cross. Bad thing happen. Bad thing up there. Not for people. Not for us." I tried to reason with him. I told him I'd just be a minute. I told him I'd stay close to the wall. I told him there was nothing up there but trees and mountains. He wouldn't move. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He looked like a man confronting his worst fear. I'm not proud of what I did next. I was frustrated. I was tired. I was a professional who'd been to war zones and jungle expeditions, and I wasn't going to let some local superstition stop me from getting the shot I wanted. I thanked Wei for his concern. I paid him extra for his trouble. I promised I'd be quick. Then I walked around him, climbed down from the watchtower, and stepped through a gap in the crumbling wall. I crossed to the north side. The moment I did, something changed. The air felt different, heavier, colder, even though the sun was still bright overhead. The sounds of the forest, birds calling, insects buzzing, wind rustling through leaves, went quiet. Not gradually, not naturally. They just stopped, like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. I stood there for a moment, telling myself it was my imagination. Elevation change, maybe. Some acoustic property of the terrain that dampened sound. There was an explanation. There was always an explanation. I raised my camera and started taking photos. The wrongness got worse the further I moved from the wall. The silence wasn't just absence of sound. It was a pressure against my eardrums, a weight that made me want to shake my head to clear it. The light seemed dimmer on this side, though when I looked up, the sun was still bright in the sky. The trees looked the same as the ones on the south side. Same species, same autumn colors, but something about them felt different, hostile, like they knew I wasn't supposed to be here. Then came the feeling of being watched. Not by way, though when I glanced back, I could see him standing frozen on top of the wall, staring at me with undisguised terror. Watched by something else. Something in the forest, in the shadows between the dark trees. Something that hadn't been paying attention a moment ago, but was now very aware that a human had crossed the line. I saw movement in my peripheral vision, just a flicker, a shadow shifting from one tree to another. I turned, camera ready, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was a deer, a bird, a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. Whatever had moved was bigger than a deer, and it hadn't moved away from me. It had moved closer. Then I heard the sound. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't an animal call. It was something between a whisper and a hum, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The trees seemed to carry it. The air seemed to vibrate with it. It sounded almost like language, but not any language I'd ever heard. Not Chinese, not any human tongue. Something older, something that shouldn't exist. I stopped taking photos. The camera felt heavy and stupid in my hands, a useless piece of technology in a place where technology didn't matter. I turned and walked back toward the wall. I didn't run. Some instinct told me not to run. Running would make me pray. Running would trigger something. So I walked, fast, faster, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath coming in short gasps that I tried to control. Behind me, I heard movement in the forest. Not one thing now, multiple things, circling, pacing me, staying just out of sight, just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispering sound was louder, surrounding me, and I could almost make out words, almost understand what was being said. Some part of my mind screamed at me not to understand, not to listen, not to stop and try to make sense of what I was hearing. Whatever was being said wasn't meant for human ears. Understanding it would be worse than not understanding it. Wei was screaming from the top of the wall. I could see him waving his arms frantically, beckoning me back. The gap in the stones was 50 feet away, 40, 30. I broke into a run. I couldn't help it. The presence behind me was too close, too vast, too aware of exactly where I was and exactly how fragile I was. I ran like I'd never run before, stumbling over rocks and roots, my camera bouncing painfully against my chest. I threw myself through the gap in the wall. I landed hard on the south side, ancient stones scraping my palms and knees raw. I scrambled to my feet and turned around. The presence was there, right at the edge of the wall. I couldn't see it clearly. It was like a heat shimmer in the air, a distortion of light that suggested something massive without revealing its shape. It filled the gap in the stones, pressing against an invisible barrier, and I could feel the weight of its attention, the cold fury of something whose territory had been violated. But it didn't cross. It hovered at the boundary, at the exact line where the wall's foundation began, and it didn't come any further. I understood, in that moment, what the wall really was. It wasn't a fortification. It wasn't a defense against armies or invaders. It was a marker, a line drawn in stone that said this far and no further, an ancient agreement between humans and something that claimed the North long before the first emperor laid the first stone. The wall wasn't built to keep them out. It was built to show us where we're allowed to be. The presence lingered for a long moment, watching me with something that might have been hatred, or might have been hunger, or might have been something I don't have words for. Then it withdrew. The distortion faded. The silence lifted. The birds started singing again. The insects started buzzing. The wind moved through the trees like wind is supposed to move. I stood there shaking for a long time. Wei climbed down from the watchtower and helped me to my feet. His face was grey. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We hiked back to the village in silence. We moved fast, not stopping to rest, not stopping to eat. The sun was setting by the time we reached the first houses, and I had never been so grateful to see electric lights and cooking smoke and the ordinary sounds of human habitation. That night, Wei came to my room. He sat across from me and told me what his family had always known. The wall is old, he said, older than the dynasties that claim to have built it. The emperors added to it, rebuilt sections, extended it to new areas. But the core, the original line, was already there, marked in the earth long before the first stones were laid. The north belongs to something else, something that was here before humans, something that agreed to stay on its side as long as humans stayed on theirs. The wall is the visible reminder of that agreement, not a barrier. Nothing could stop those things if they wanted to cross. A boundary line, a treaty written in stone. The millions of workers who died building the wall, Wei said. The ones who gave their lives to extend it, to maintain it, to rebuild it after earthquakes and erosion. They weren't dying for an emperor's vanity. They weren't dying for military strategy. They were maintaining the agreement, keeping the line visible, making sure both sides remembered where the boundary was. I asked Wei what they were. The things on the north side, the presence I'd felt. He shook his head. His grandfather had asked the same question, and his grandfather's father before him. There was no answer. They were old, older than human memory. They owned the north the way humans owned the south. That was all anyone knew. That was all anyone needed to know. I checked my camera after Wei left. Most of the photos from the north side were corrupted, static, blur, like the camera had malfunctioned at exactly the moment I crossed the line. But a few came out. They showed the forest, the mountains, the muted colors I remembered, the dark trees pressing close together, the empty wilderness that wasn't really empty at all. In one of the photos, at the very edge of the frame, there was a shape between the trees, a shadow that was almost human, but not quite, a suggestion of something tall, something watching, something that had noticed me the moment I stepped where I didn't belong. The image was blurry, indistinct, but I could see enough. I could see the outline of something that shouldn't exist. I deleted all the photos, every single one. I didn't want to look at them again. I didn't want anyone else to look at them either. I flew home a week later. I never published the photos from the wild war. I never talked about what happened in those mountains. When clients asked why I came back from China with nothing to show for it, I told them the trip didn't work out. Bad weather, equipment problems. Sometimes assignments just fail. But I think about it. Every day I think about it. I look at maps now, and I see all the walls humans have built throughout history. Hadrian's Wall in Britain, running coast to coast across the narrowest part of the island. The ancient walls of Babylon and Jericho and Constantinople. The fortifications that lined the edges of every great civilization, every empire that ever rose and fell. Historians say they were built for defense, to stop armies, to protect territory from invasion. I know better now. Some walls aren't built to keep things out. They're built to mark the edge of where we're allowed to exist, to remind us that the world is bigger than we think and older, and there are places that don't belong to us, places that never did, places where something else has lived since long before our ancestors came down from the trees, something that tolerates our presence only because we've agreed to stay on our side of the line. I crossed that line once. I felt what was waiting on the other side. I made it back because I was close to the boundary, because I ran fast, because whatever was out there decided to let me go. I won't make that mistake again. The Great Wall wasn't meant to stop humans. It was meant to show us where we end, where our territory stops and something else's begins. I used to think the world belonged to us, that humans were the dominant species, the masters of the planet, free to go wherever we wanted and do whatever we pleased. Now I know the truth. We're allowed to live in certain places, on certain terms, as long as we remember the agreements our ancestors made, the lines they drew, the boundaries they promised to respect. The walls are still standing, most of them anyway, crumbling and forgotten, reduced to ruins and tourist attractions, but still there, still marking the edges. I hope they stand forever. I hope we never forget what they're really for, because I've seen what's waiting on the other side. And I know that if the lines ever fall, if we ever forget the old agreements and push too far into places we don't belong, there won't be any negotiating. There won't be any second chances. There will just be whatever comes flooding across the boundary into a world that was never entirely ours to begin with.